When most people hear the words Chrysler Town and Country, the first thing they think of is the uncool minivan. Well, long before the uncool minivan, there was a really cool town and country. Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter of the Automotive Evolution. Here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, a great collection, more than 170 cars here in Phoenix. It really tells the full story of the automotive journey. And this car right here is part of that. It is a 1947 Chrysler Town and Country. You know, in the art world, they have a term called mixed media art. Well, I think this is mixed media automotive art. That's because it uses both steel and wood. In fact, that's where they get the name. Town and Country. Town, well, that was the steel portion. Wood, that was the country portion. But before we talk too much about this car in particular, let's talk a little bit about the history of using wood in the automobile, because it goes back really to the earliest days of when the automobile was being put on the road. In fact, you go back to the old Tin Lizzie, the Model T, well, that used wood both in the wheels, it used wood in the floorboards. A lot of cars were using wood as part of the chassis, actually part of the structure. In fact, in the United States, that was used fairly commonly up until the 1930s. And if you go back and look at a car called a depot hack is essentially what we think of today as a station wagon. Depot, of course, stood for the train depot, and the hack was the vehicle they used to get passengers to and from someplace. So that's why they called it a depot hack, a wagon to get your visitors to your resort to and from the train station. But those depot hacks had specialty bodies, and they had to be built, for example, on the old Model T chassis or whatever chassis they were using at that point in time. But you'll notice that the bodies that they were using, those wooden bodies, the structures that they put on those chassis, were really pretty straight. Just straight pieces of wood, flat pieces of wood. That was pretty simple to do. Building something that was more stylish, more creative, well, that was a much more complicated process. But that's exactly what they decided to do with this 1947 Chrysler Town and Country. The Town and Country name actually goes back before World War II. Chrysler was building a station wagon using the same concept, steel and wood, to make it sort of a stylish car. That was built in 1942 and 1941. Of course, when World War II came along and automotive production for civilians came to an end, the production of that car came to an end as well. After World War II ended, Chrysler was powering things back up, like all the automotive manufacturers, trying to come up with something new and different until they could really release their new models, which in most cases came along in about 1948 or so. So this was an idea, a way to come up with something that was interesting and different without spending an awful lot of money on revamping the pre-war styles that everything was being built on at that point in time. So they came up with this concept of using the town and country look. Now, they weren't trying to save money with this. This is actually an expensive car for its day. But it was an interesting way to take the existing bodies that they had, the existing style that they had, and add some value to it in terms of putting all this wood on it. Also, you have to remember, there were a lot of materials that were hard to come by after World War II. Wood at this point was probably a little bit easier to come by, so they were able to get the wood they needed to do this without having to battle for steel that they were going to be using for the stamped steel. So the Chrysler Town and Country was really a perfect solution for a way to revamp their line after World War II using materials that were easy to find. Putting this together was no easy process. First, you had to get the wood. In this case, it came from a Chrysler subsidiary, a company called Pekin Wood Products that was in Arkansas. It was shipped up from Arkansas all the way to Detroit. And of course, then you had to have the metal portion, the stamped steel portion, and that came from a company called Briggs. Once again, that was shipped into Detroit as well. And there, it all had to be put together. The body, the wooden portions were formed first, and then everything else was put on top of that. And if you look closely at the wood that's on a Chrysler Town and Country from this era, the woodwork itself, the craftsmanship is absolutely amazing. The way it's all put together, the way it's got actual little, holes right here with pins that are put in to make sure everything's solid. And you got to remember, this is all wood. Years later, they would get into what they would call the tin woody concept, where they had stamped steel with either a veneer or at some point, they just went to a little piece of vinyl that covered it that looked like wood. But at this point in time, all this was real wood. So what you needed to put this together was true craftsmen, people who understood the concept of how to make the wood come together. And you got to remember, steel is easy, right? Once you stamp the steel, it always retains its shape. The wood is a completely different creature. First, it has to be dried properly, because if the wood is formed too quickly and it hasn't dried properly, it'll start to bend and crack and do things that you hadn't anticipated. So they had to bend it, they had to mold it, they had to do everything to get it just right and make sure it was in place and then sealed just exactly right. And when you look once again at this 1947 Chrysler Town and Country, the craftsmanship, absolutely amazing what they were able to do with the combination of the wood and the metal. One of the styling touches that I particularly love on this Town and Country are the hinges on the back of the trunk. I mean, these days, of course, hinges are buried underneath the bodywork, underneath the steel or the aluminum body. But for this car, they didn't do that. They wanted the hinges outside because they had to connect to the wood, of course. And these things, well, there's nothing subtle about them. They are massive, industrial strength. And of course, they needed to be, because this trunk made out of wood was really, really heavy. I love the way this massive hood operates, because when you lift it, let's move this down here, you'll notice it actually pulls out just a little bit and then pulls up. And it is just an absolutely massive piece of metal. And what's interesting is the engine inside, well, it's not nearly that big. You actually have an awful lot of room in front of the engine right here that's going way forward, which is really just there to be automotive art. Inside, in that engine compartment in there, well, there is a 6-cylinder motor. I know for something as big, it's hard to believe it's only a 6-cylinder, but that's all they used back then. It only had 114 horsepower. It was a Spitfire engine. They call it an L head, where the valves were off to the side. But once again, it was enough because, you weren't doing a lot of, high-speed freeway driving back in those days. It didn't have a lot of freeways. It was before the interstates came along. If you opted for the Chrysler Town and Country convertible, well, if you did that, you got the bigger engine, the 323 cubic inch engine. This one is 250 cubic inches. The 323 cubic inches also came along with 135 horsepower. So it was more powerful, but this was enough to get along back in those days. So, but once again, it's just amazing when you look at the space up front and look at all this area up here that, today we would probably think of it as a crumple zone. It would actually probably be slightly helpful. But, you were used to seeing the radiator being way up front. And in fact, it was a very unique way of doing it, where the air would flow up through and then up to the radiator, and then of course the engine, that 6-cylinder engine back in there. And especially when you look inside there and you realize there is just so much room. You could practically stand inside the engine compartment and work on this car. There's so much room in there. But it was a massive car with a 250 cubic inch engine, which 250 cubic inches isn't small, especially for a 6-cylinder inline engine. But with this front end, with all this space, it just kind of gets lost in there. It's important to point out that they weren't using wood because they wanted to save money. In fact, this was an expensive luxury car for its day. Think about this. If you wanted an 8-passenger limousine that was built on the same Windsor chassis as this one, it was going to cost you around $2,100 for the limousine. If you wanted this 4-door Town and Country built on the Windsor chassis, it was going to cost you more than $2,300, more than $200 more than the limousine was going to cost you. And if you decided that you wanted to bump up to the Town and Country convertible, now that was actually built on the New Yorker chassis back then, but that was going to cost nearly $3,000. It was a very, very expensive concept. And that's exactly what they wanted this to be. They wanted this to be the person who lives in New York and has a house in the Hamptons or up in Connecticut, and this is the car that they would drive to and from the town and the country, the Town and Country. I love all of the styling touches associated with this particular car. First off, you'll notice that they also used wood extensively. I mean, it's a wood frame here for the door, but then also the wood panels inside. A really subtle thing that you probably won't even get a chance to notice, but the surround for the speaker, which is right here, is also made of wood. Up above in the roof, you'll see that in between the fabric liners, or the leather liners, they also have wood strips up there. They went to an amazing degree of detail when they were building this car. It's actually really, really nice. I love this radio, by the way, because think about this. This is 1947. I mean, concept of a radio in a car, well, I mean, it goes back to, long before this, but it hadn't been very fancy. This was not just a radio. This was a piece of art, almost Art Deco. We actually could control the tone of the car. car. Imagine that. Not just hearing sound, but get to control, whether I can hear the DJ just a little better or the music just a little better. It actually had push buttons, so you could do that. This had a semi-automatic fluid drive transmission, which was pretty cool. You still got a clutch down here, but the semi-automatic. It still has a metal dashboard. You remember years later, of course, we're going to get rid of the metal and go to the padded dash because it was a lot safer. But this particular car had all kinds of options when it came probably from the factory. It's got the sun visor. I always love the sun visor. It's a great way to keep the sun out of your eyes on those annoying days when the sun is trying to peek in. It's got the spotlights on either side. It's got the fog driving lights up front. It's just a really cool piece of automotive art inside and out. And once again, this big, huge steering wheel, the idea, remember, it didn't have power steering. The idea of needing a big steering wheel was so that you had more control and more ability to control the way the wheel was going and kind of use that leverage as you were making a turn. But I love, boy, the automotive art inside and out, the wood panels, the steel, the cloth, the leather, everything in this is just perfect. One of the styling touches that I love on this car is this thing right here. Let's call it a fob that goes on the handle to roll up the windows. As you would roll up the windows, this would flip out and you could actually just handle it and not have to worry about this moving one way or the other or being stuck. It was a very stylish way of giving you something you could grip, but at the same time making it look cool. So when you weren't using it, it just laid flat against the door. The Chrysler Town and Country was an interesting experiment in luxury design after World War II, but it really didn't last long. In fact, they stopped using the Town and Country in this particular style with the wood and everything in 1950, and they attached Town and Country to a line of station wagons that was going to come later. And ultimately, as we mentioned at the very beginning of this video, Town and Country was used as the name for the minivan, which became very, very popular and a big, huge seller for Chrysler for a very, very long time. What spelled the end of this car? I mean, yes, there were some people who bought it. It was never a high number production car, but the reality is the cost of putting this together, the cost of building this car was very, very high. Because as I mentioned, you needed craftsmen who could put this wood together. When it came to body panels, they could just get stamped out and thrown on. But the wood, well, that had to be massaged. It had to be perfectly sanded. It had to be smooth. All the tongue and grooves had to fit just right. All of the elements had to work properly for it to come together. And once again, the craftsmen needed to do that. Well, they're becoming rarer, and the wood associated was more expensive. The cost of doing all that just became too much. And besides, Chrysler had brought out its World War II, post-World War II era cars. They were looking more at the future of the automobile, realizing this was kind of an archaic kind of look, saying, you know what, we need to move forward in terms of what our styling is going to be. And the Chrysler Town and Country, with its beautiful combination of mixed media automotive art, the wood together with the steel, it just wasn't necessary for Chrysler to move into the next generation of the automotive evolution.